Okay, moving on to the last and final segment of today's show. I wanted to talk about one of the most disappointing teams in the NFL. And when I say disappointing, I think it's funny that if I would have told you before the season started, the Arizona Cardinals would finish 8-8 and one game out of a playoff spot, you would think, oh, that's not a bad season when you consider the fact that last year, the Arizona Cardinals only won 5 games. They were a team with a top 10 pick, and they were a super young team. They were super inconsistent, and going into the season, they were not really people that expected them to make the playoffs. But that is not how I look at the ending of this Arizona Cardinals season. I believe the Arizona Cardinals have an argument to be the most disappointing team in the NFL this season. And a lot of it has to do with coaching. A lot of it has to do with just how it ended and the exact situation of how this Arizona Cardinal playoff run fell apart. And it's funny because if you remember, the Arizona Cardinals at one point in the season were 5-2. And even though they did have some hiccups against some teams that you would have preferred them to beat, like the Detroit Lions, like the Carolina Panthers, the Arizona Cardinals were still a team that was finding a way to at least win football games. You remember week 1, they went into San Francisco and earned a big win over the 49ers. And at the time, the San Francisco 49ers were obviously the defending NFC champions. They were a team that was coming off a Super Bowl appearance, and we thought at the time that San Francisco, that was also when they were relatively healthy as well. We all thought they were going to be a really good football team. They also take a loss to Detroit and Carolina, as I mentioned, but they bounced back nicely, getting a win over Dallas on the road in prime time on Monday Night Football, getting a win on Sunday Night Football over the Seattle Seahawks, getting the win over the Buffalo Bills after the Hail Mary, and after that win against the Bills, there was a time when this Arizona Cardinal team was sitting at 6-3 and going into that Thursday Night Football game against the Seattle Seahawks, that was a big game. And it was really during that game when it hit me like, wow, this Arizona Cardinal team, even though I didn't necessarily think they were going to fall apart this badly, it kind of hit me that night that, okay, this team may just be a year away. As much as I love Kyler Murray, as much as I love DeAndre Hopkins, the defense just doesn't look great right now without Chandler Jones. I love Budda Baker as a player. I think Byron Murphy's a really good young corner. I really like what Hassan Reddick did this year. He's obviously not even a guarantee to be back on the Arizona Cardinals next season, but they lose that game to Seattle, they lose to New England, and they lose at home to the Rams. So the Cardinals lose 3 games in a row, and that's really when the concern started to hit you. But the Cardinals did bounce back nicely, winning back-to-back games against the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Eagles. But I think that's the number one problem I have right now. When you look at the Arizona Cardinals season, look at their 8 wins. 4 of them came against the NFC East, the worst division in probably the history of the NFL. Now, they beat Buffalo, which was very nice, but let's face facts. They could have easily lost that game if DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray both don't just make an absurd play. And then they beat San Francisco week 1. They beat the New York Jets, one of the worst teams I've ever seen. They beat Seattle. Okay, that was a really good win. And that's really about it. That's really all this Arizona Cardinal team was able to do in terms of picking up quality victories this season. And even though the only way you could look at this season as a successful season for the Arizona Cardinals would be purely just looking at the win column, if you want to make the argument, the Arizona Cardinals won 3 games a couple of years ago when Steve Wilkes was the head coach. Kliff Kingsbury comes in last year during his first season, and the Arizona Cardinals are able to win 5 games. So that's an improvement. And then this year, the Arizona Cardinals win 8 games, so that's an improvement. And I'm not saying that I would fire Kliff Kingsbury. My only thing is I just have a very difficult time believing right now that Kliff Kingsbury is definitely the right coach to lead this team to the promised land. Because I'll tell you what, Kyler Murray obviously wasn't great the last couple games of the season, but it was clear to me that he was super banged up and his head coach was just straight up not putting him in a possible position to succeed. And that is such a big problem with this Arizona Cardinal team. I just think throughout the last couple games of the season, Kliff Kingsbury got outcoached by Kyle Shanahan and Robert Saleh, especially when you consider the talent gap in that game between the two teams. I mean, You cannot lose that game to San Francisco at home when the 49ers are banged up playing for basically nothing and you're playing for your playoff lives. I just don't think that's a loss that cannot happen when you're the Arizona Cardinals and you're playing against the Los Angeles Rams and their backup quarterback, John Wolford, in a game where you have to win. And keep in mind, the Arizona Cardinals started off Sunday's game against the Los Angeles Rams really well. John Wolford throws an early interception. Arizona also marches right down the field and scores a touchdown. They get up 7-0, and then they never scored again. That is a huge, huge problem, and this was another game where with all of the stakes, this was such a high-stakes game. All of the money was on the table here, and Sean McVay just coached circles around Kliff Kingsbury, You could also tell that Kliff Kingsbury didn't have a backup quarterback that he was comfortable in putting just a little bit of faith in. All I've heard about this kid, Chris Trevler, that came in for the Arizona Cardinals was that he was like their version of Taysom Hill. But it's not like Kliff Kingsbury called the game like that. He didn't call any design runs for him. And I understand it's a backup quarterback, but look at this kid, Johnny Wolford, for the Rams. He took his first NFL snaps on Sunday against the Cardinals in a game where his team had to win, and I believe due to proper coaching, he played really well. He was swinging the ball down the field. He made a couple really nice throws, and that's why the Rams ended up getting the win. And it's funny because Kliff Kingsbury, I don't want to sit here and say he's done a horrible job since he's become the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, but there's talent on this team between Kyler Murray, Kenyon Drake, DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk. Dan Arnold had a nice season. I think their offensive line was a little bit better than expected. On defense, I understand Chandler Jones got hurt, but you had a guy in Hassan Reddick who had a really nice bounce-back season. Budda Baker established himself as one of the best players in all of football on the defensive side. Byron Murphy had a really nice season. So there are plenty of guys on defense that stepped up for Arizona, but at the same time, still, Kliff Kingsbury was not able to lead this team to the playoffs, especially when he had a really nice path to the last two games of the season, playing against teams in San Francisco and the Rams, two teams that were not healthy, two teams playing with backup quarterbacks, and with the Arizona Cardinals playing with their playoff lives on the line, they were not able to get the job done. And if you're an Arizona Cardinal fan, I guess you could look at it and say, okay, we went 8-8, and from a win perspective, that's an improvement. But I got to be honest with you, as a neutral observer in this situation, this would not be how I would observe that situation at all. If I was an Arizona Cardinal fan, I would be very disappointed in the way that this season ended. You were the healthier team, you were the more talented team, and you were the team playing with a little bit more on the table. The Arizona Cardinals, after the loss to the San Francisco 49ers, put their playoff destiny in the hands of the Chicago Bears. That should have been a wake-up call for this Arizona Cardinal team saying, look, we got to execute better. We got to be more disciplined. The Arizona Cardinals were the most penalized team in the NFL this season. If you want to make the playoffs, that is something that they're going to have to really improve in, because teams that get penalized a lot and are not well disciplined, those are not teams that make the playoffs. And Kliff Kingsbury, I'll say this, I think his clock management just straight up has to get better. To be honest with you guys, there would be many games this past season where I would watch the Arizona Cardinals and straight up, one of my main conclusions coming out of the game would be, wow, Kliff Kingsbury, their head coach, just cost them. And Kyler Murray is a very talented player. I think he could be a special player, and he could lead this Arizona Cardinal franchise to places that they've never been, along with DeAndre Hopkins. I think Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds are two very good running backs, and the Cardinals' offensive line, as I mentioned, played a little bit better than I expected throughout the season, but I'm just not 100% sure how, if you're an Arizona Cardinal fan, you could go into this offseason and going into next season with confidence that Kliff Kingsbury could definitely be your head coach that is properly suited to take you to the promised land along with Kyler. Because here's the thing, we've seen a lot of very good quarterbacks play in the NFL before, whether it's Dan Marino, whether it's Peyton Manning before he played for Tony Dungy. You know, if you don't have good coaching, it doesn't matter how talented you are. It's very hard to win Super Bowls when you don't have at least a competent head coach. And there has been nothing that Kliff Kingsbury has necessarily showed me throughout his first two seasons in Arizona. And oh yeah, throughout his first 6 seasons as a college head coach at Texas Tech that makes me confident that he could be a coach that leads his team to winning and their ultimate goals. Because let's face facts, Kliff Kingsbury had Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback when he was the head coach of Texas Tech, and he couldn't win anything. Their defense was that atrocious. I understand in the Big 12, that's the mantra. They don't really play defense in the Big 12. And when you go to Texas Tech, a lot of times those are the kids that just didn't get into Texas, and no one really dreams to go to Texas Tech opposed to going to Texas. But still, Kliff Kingsbury couldn't win there, and the Arizona Cardinals decided to bring him in as the head coach, and that was a very gutsy decision by the general manager, Steve Keim, because keep in mind, he was the same general manager that drafted Josh Rosen, the same general manager that brought in Kliff Kingsbury after 1 year of Steve Wilks, and he was very criticized for that decision by many people in the NFL media. Now, I do believe the Arizona Cardinals are in a better spot now with Kyler and Kliff as their quarterback head coach combination than they were back then with Josh Rosen and Steve Wilks. So maybe if you're an Arizona Cardinal fan and you want one optimistic takeaway from this whole segment, I guess that would be it. But I'll say this, if I was an Arizona Cardinal fan, I would have a lot of trouble sleeping after the way Sunday's game went against the Los Angeles Rams, because as bad as these last 2 games have been, you really did have an opportunity to make up for it, make the playoffs, and if you get blown out by the New Orleans Saints or blown out by the Green Bay Packers, okay, whatever. Going to the playoffs at least is a positive experience for your fan base. Going to the playoffs is at least something that Kyler Murray and Kliff Kingsbury as a coach and a player could gain experience from, but ultimately the Arizona Cardinals were not good enough. And it's funny because against the Philadelphia Eagles a couple weeks ago, the game the Arizona Cardinals won, it was a 33-26 final. Arizona wins that game, and I remember saying to myself, wow, even though Arizona won, they are lucky because Kliff Kingsbury almost lost them the game. His play calling, his clock management was just not good, and I think that aspect of Arizona really needs to improve if they want to go places. Now, next year, their defense will hopefully be a little bit healthier. Another year for Budda Baker, another year for Byron Murphy. Hopefully that aspect of their team will improve. But next season, I do believe Kliff Kingsbury will be going in on the hot seat, especially if Arizona doesn't make the playoffs. Because if they don't, I'm not necessarily sure if he has proven enough to 100% be the guy for the head coaching job.